With this assortment of footage, we have the opportunity to go a bit more in-depth into the early X-1. Elsewhere on this disc is a U.S. Air Force briefing film from 1948, produced just a couple of months after the first supersonic flight in October '47. The footage for that film was mostly shot in December of '47, and only a fraction of it was used for that production. Much of the remaining unused footage was set aside and eventually ended up being transferred to the National Archives for storage, which is where we found it. While most of this film was in pretty good condition, it was not in any sort of sensible order. So we decided to assemble it into a mythical composite mission, allowing a deep dive into the preparations behind an X-1 flight. We open with scenes of a walk-around of the X-1 done by Chuck Yeager himself. One has to wonder if Yeager has any idea of what life has in store for him at this point. A couple of details about the X-1 immediately jump out at me. First, it seems pretty clear that this is a hand-built one-off aircraft. We can see tool marks on the sheet metal, there's an unevenness to the paint, and many of the labels in the cockpit seem to have been hand-painted. This is a working aircraft. This is not a pretty hangar queen. It also seems like a pretty uncomfortable aircraft to climb in and out of, even on the ground. The X-1 was famously built in the shape of a .50 caliber bullet, as that was a shape that was known to go transonic pretty easily. There were 3 separate first-generation X-1 aircraft built by Bell. 2 of those are documented in this footage, tail numbers 6062 and 6063. 6062 was the aircraft that Yeager used for the first supersonic flight, and today it's on display at the Milestones of Flight Gallery at the National Air and Space Museum on the Mall in Washington, D.C. Both 6062 and 6063 had long careers as research aircraft, completing 150 flights between them. 6063 was eventually reworked into the X-1E, which flew until it was retired in 1958. That's the aircraft that shows up in many of the establishing shots throughout the I Dream of Jeannie TV show that was popular in the 60s, and the aircraft is still on display today at NASA's Armstrong Flight Research Center at Edwards Air Force Base. The third first-generation X-1, number 6064, didn't fare nearly as well as the other 2. 6064 had a longer development and assembly cycle and had some pretty significant systems differences from the earlier planes. Instead of using pressurized nitrogen to deliver propellants to the rocket motor, 6064 used turbopumps that were powered by decomposing hydrogen peroxide. This third aircraft only completed 1 glide flight in the summer of 1951 and was lost to a fire and explosion later that year during a static test on the ground. The cause of that fire was traced to a gasket made from a material called Ulmer leather, which also led to the loss of the X-1D, the X-1A, and one of the later X-2 aircraft. We get a quick peek here at Bell test pilot Chalmers Goodland, who was much better known by his nickname Slick. There was a fictionalized version of Goodland in the film The Right Stuff. He became the Bell project pilot for the early Muroc field flights after the death of Jack Woollums, who flew the initial glide flights of the aircraft at Pinecastle Field in Florida. Woollums sadly died in the crash of a Bell P-39 that had been converted in preparation for the National Air Races in Cleveland. The sequence of tank testing scenes that we just saw are notable in that the first few shots we see testing with no motor installed. Note that the engine compartment is empty. This is a few shots back, yet gas is being vented, presumably as part of some type of fluid flow test. We also get some intriguing shots of the fuel storage tanks, as well as the gas production and management equipment. In the later footage, you'll note that the engine has been installed and that testing is underway, with shock diamonds clearly visible in the exhaust plume. Also, notice the seeming indifference to any sort of safety protocol. At least to my current day eyes, there's a pretty lackadaisical approach to some pretty dangerous activities on display in this footage. Note that there's a simple cable yoke attached to the main landing gear in order to restrain the aircraft as these motor tests take place. We can clearly see 4 separate combustion chambers on the XLR-11 rocket motor, and we can also see the individual chambers being ignited and turned off. The XLR-11 could not be throttled, but pilots could vary the total thrust, essentially simulating a throttle capability, by turning individual chambers on and off with switches in the cockpit. We'll be back in a moment when propellant and gas loading begins. We now move on to the fueling process for a powered X-1 flight. The XLR-11 rocket motor used liquid oxygen as an oxidizer, as well as a mixture of alcohol and water for fuel. With a full fuel load, an X-1 could fly for almost 5 minutes under power. As this tractor rumbles by towing the X-1, I must confess that I am amused by the simple aircraft handling vehicles being used throughout this footage. This particular vehicle was produced by the Clark Equipment Company, and in a triumph of marketing, the company dubbed it a Clark Tour. We start off with what appears to be loading of the pressurized nitrogen tanks using a loading point aft of the cockpit on the underside of the X-1. Next, liquid oxygen will be loaded into a point just above the wing. This is another point in the film where the 40s era safety practices are just appalling. Liquid oxygen is terribly volatile stuff, and just a simple spark can set off a serious fire. When we move to the footage of advanced X-1 variants, you'll see a significant increase in the use of protective gear, as well as a more formal attitude overall. The alcohol and water is dispensed from a tank delivered to the aircraft via a trailer. The mix of alcohol and water would allow for lower combustion chamber temperatures while still maintaining a degree of volatility. Note that a pretty standard fuel nozzle is being used here, with the addition of a section of adapter tubing added to the end of the nozzle. A significant amount of infrastructure was put in place at Muroc for the X-1 program. In addition to the tank farm that we can see in a few of these shots, there was also a nitrogen plant on site. We can see frost on the equipment used to deliver liquid oxygen to the aircraft. We'll be back in a moment when the process of loading the X-1 into the B-29 bomb bay begins. Here's our first good view of the sunken loading pit used to place the X-1 into the B-29 bomb bay. The pit was engineered so that there was just enough clearance over the X-1 to tow the B-29 mothership over the aircraft, after which the X-1 would be winched up into the B-29 using the bomb handling gear that was already in place on board. There were similar loading pits in place at both the Bell factory in Buffalo as well as at Pine Castle Field in Florida, where the initial glide tests took place. The process of lowering the X-1 into the pit strikes me as astonishingly, agrarian or agricultural. Keep in mind that this is a multi-million-dollar aircraft, and the manner in which it's being horsed around simply wouldn't happen today with a high-value piece of aerospace technology. A small tractor is used to slowly lower the aircraft into the pit, guided by a few spotters. Check out the small clearances between the flying surfaces and the edges of the loading pit. Amazingly, the loading pit at Edwards Air Force Base, former Muroc Field, is still there and is visible on Google Maps at the extreme west end of the ramp at what is known today as the South Base at Edwards. Later, the landing pit was replaced by a set of 3 hydraulic jacks that would lift the B-29 high in the air, allowing the Parasite aircraft to be towed beneath for loading. You can see this procedure being used in the footage for later X-1 variants that you'll find elsewhere on this DVD. Again, we're treated to an appearance by yet another fun ground tug. This one a tracked vehicle known as a Cle-Track. This particular vehicle was built by a company called the Cleveland Tractor Company. Let's talk just a bit about the B-29 mothership that we see being used here. This aircraft, with the tail number 21800, was used throughout the X-1 program, both for the early models and the later advanced variants. While the B-29 was a Boeing product, this particular one was built by Bell at a government-owned plant near Atlanta that they operated under contract. The program also had a B-50 for a while. A B-50 is essentially an upgraded B-29, but that aircraft was destroyed when the third X-1, tail number 6064, was lost during a ground test. Keep an eye on the B-29 tail numbers as you watch all of the X-1 variant footage on this package. While the paint job might change, the aircraft stays the same. We'll remain silent for much of the remainder of this video, dropping in from time to time to point out some of the more intriguing details. The chase plane being used here is a P-80, the first operational U.S. jet fighter. While it had a very brief stint as a fighter, the trainer version of this aircraft, the T-33, went on to have a very long and illustrious career. In fact, the last T-33 was not retired by the U.S. Air Force until 1997, a full 50 years after this footage was shot. Note the cameras mounted in the nose of the P-80. We can pretty much assume that some of the aerial footage we'll see in a bit was shot from these cameras. Getting into the cockpit of the early X-1 was certainly a chore for the pilots, especially on the first generation X-1 models with side entry cockpits. As we can see here, the pilot climbs into a rudimentary elevator, little more than a simple step with some guide rails, and then rides that down a few feet until he can wiggle into the cockpit. All of this has to take place while wearing a parachute and a flight jacket. The door would then be lowered into place using a chain, and the X-1 pilot would pull that door into place and seal it by actuating a moving handle. For his first supersonic flight, this process was complicated for Yeager by the fact that he was suffering from broken ribs, which made closing the hatch painful. He ended up using a short section of broomstick as a lever to help close the handle. Later X-1 variants had traditional canopy-style cockpits that could be entered from the top, making the ingress process much simpler. This concludes the commentary for this section of film, so enjoy the following shots of the X-1 launching, in flight, and landing. Before I let you go, I must give a hearty thank you to aerospace historian and author Jay Miller. His book, X-Planes, X-1 through X-45, is a must-have for anyone with an appreciation for the history of these remarkable aircraft, and was an indispensable reference to have on hand as I assembled this video package. I believe that it's currently out of print, but it's well worth the effort and expense if you were to seek out a used copy.